Hi, it's Jimmy, and I'm going to be talking about Things Fall Apart and other books by Chinua Achebe. So, Chinua Achebe is probably the most famous Nigerian author. I'd heard of him before, and especially of Things Fall Apart, which is his most famous book and his masterpiece. But I only ever read any of his books starting earlier this year. Since then, I've read a few of them, and I've got another one that I'm planning to read. And I think he's an absolutely brilliant writer, and maybe even qualifies as my favourite writer, even though I only discovered his writing earlier this year. But the first one I read, which is his first novel, is Things Fall Apart. It was published in 1958, which was 2 years before Nigeria became independent of the British Empire in 1960. It's set in the late 19th century in an Igbo village in southeastern Nigeria, which at least at the beginning of the book is relatively untouched by colonialism. I think it's a brilliant book. It's very short, but it packs so many different threads in there. The story is gripping, the characters you become invested in them quite quickly. There's lots of shades of grey. It's easy to read. It's not complicated in a difficult, heavy way. It doesn't morally dumb anything down for you. So the writing is absolutely brilliant. It's a powerful story. It's a gripping story, and you're left with loads to think about at the end, and it will stick with you for a long time. Another novel that I've read by him recently is called A Man of the People. And this book came out in 1966. Shortly after it came out, there was an attempted coup in Nigeria, which was the beginning of the process that led to a part of Nigeria declaring independence, forming the country Biafra, and that led to the Nigeria-Biafra War, also known as the Nigerian Civil War. And because that process began shortly after this book came out, and this book is kind of a bit of a political satire. There's elements of political satire. It's quite a satirical novel. A lot of it is about a guy and his wants and needs, basically, and his drives for revenge or for success, or his principles and then how they become compromised. Most of it is about this guy and those different parts of him pulling him one way or another. But there's also this political satire element, and there's a bit of plotting going on in the book. On the blurb and on Goodreads and everywhere that you'll see it promoted, it's described as sort of a prophetic book because it came out, it touches on plotting and coups and things like that, and then that sort of thing started happening in Nigeria right after it came out. So I went into it kind of expecting a book, a political satire about a coup or something like that. But that element of the plot was actually much smaller than I expected, and it focused much more on this more personal story and less on the political story. I did enjoy it. It is a good read. It's well written again. He is a brilliant writer. It's not as mind-blowingly good as Things Fall Apart, but it is good. I'm glad I read it. So, as I mentioned, in 1967, the year after A Man of the People came out, Biafra broke away and became a short-lived independent country until 3 years later in 1970, when it was reabsorbed into Nigeria after a bloody war. And Chinua Achebe actually played a role in some of these events. He lived in Biafra during its existence and during the war, and he was part, I believe, of a committee that helped write a kind of a manifesto for what the people setting up Biafra were planning to do in peacetime when the war ended, and they would hopefully have been able to set up their new country in the way they wanted to do it, which never came to be due to the way the war ended. But over 40 years after the end of that war, in 2012, Chinua Achebe's final book of his lifetime was published, There Was a Country, A Personal History of Biafra. And I haven't read this yet. I've bought it. It looks super interesting and really good, and I can't wait to read it. It kind of, from what I understand, combines history with his personal history to some extent, and there's some of his poems in there. So I've read him a quote from him where he talks about during the Biafra years he mainly wrote poetry rather than stories or novels, because the short form was more sort of accessible to him with so much going on. So yeah, a combination of history, really interesting history, personal history, and poetry sounds great. So I'm really looking forward to reading that. And unfortunately, it was his last book. He died in 2013, the year after this came out. The one other book that I have read by him is actually more of a couple of essays. So Penguin, in their Penguin Great Ideas series, published a book with 2 of his essays in it. So the title on the front of the book is An Image of Africa, which actually is quite a short essay. I think it's about 28 pages or something like that. And then the other 80 or so pages of the book are another essay by him called The Trouble with Nigeria. An Image of Africa was originally given as a lecture and then later published as an essay. It's a discussion of Joseph Conrad's book, Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness has, since it was published really, been put on a bit of a pedestal. It's been quite highly esteemed. It's been on a lot of university syllabuses. But Chinua Achebe's assessment of it is quite direct in that he thinks it's a very racist portrayal, and the other aspects of it don't justify such a racist book being held in such high esteem over 100 years after it came out. The Trouble with Nigeria is another essay. I think it was written shortly after the death of a politician in Nigeria who Achebe admired and had a lot of interesting ideas. And Achebe kind of looks at issues he sees in Nigeria's politics and society, issues facing the country at the time that the essay was written, and directions that it could be taken, with a little bit of history in there of how things got to this situation. So that was quite an interesting essay. An Image of Africa, the essay talking about Heart of Darkness, I think that I agreed with most of what he said. It was quite convincing. I read Heart of Darkness in order to read An Image of Africa, basically because I was getting into Chinua Achebe and I wanted to read this book with a couple of essays. So I thought I'll read the book he's critiquing first, Heart of Darkness, because it looks quite short. I'll get to it quite quickly. And I really did not enjoy reading it. Apart from everything you can say that Achebe says better than me about the racist aspects of it, I just found it unreadable. It was like dragging my eyes to a treacle. I really didn't enjoy the style or the content or pretty much anything about it. And I think that coloured my reading of the essay An Image of Africa a little bit, because I had just finished Heart of Darkness when I read that essay, and I think my brain didn't really want to engage with Heart of Darkness any more than it had to after suffering through the actual book itself. I think I'll have to read An Image of Africa again at some point with a bit of distance between me and Heart of Darkness before I fully take it in and think about it. So while I've only read a couple of his novels and a couple of his essays, and I've got this other one that I'm really looking forward to reading, and he's got a couple of other novels that I'm really looking forward to reading, one thing that had sort of bugged me a little bit, especially when reading Things Fall Apart and A Man of the People, which is the portrayal of women in his books. And there's a bit of a combination of portrayal of misogynistic society or misogynistic people and communities in a way where it's a bit uncomfortable to read about. But on the other side, there is the question of how much is this the character and the community, and how much is this coming from Achebe. And I think, for example, there are plenty of books, mainly by women, that touch on or talk about or are set in context where there is serious misogyny going on, and it does make you uncomfortable to read, but it centres the woman's experience, and it's not reductive. It doesn't reduce the woman to a victim of that. It doesn't reduce them to the way that they interact with the men in their lives. So an example of a book like that by another Nigerian writer is Oyinkan Braithwaite's book, My Sister the Serial Killer, that was recently on the Booker Prize long list. And that's a funny book. It's sort of satirical-ish as well, bit of a thriller. But it also, the two of the central characters are sisters who have grown up with a very abusive father. And I think that is an example of a book that where it talks about and represents misogyny in a realistic way without falling into misogyny itself, which I'm not sure that Achebe achieves. So those sorts of thoughts were going around my head while I was reading and thinking about these books, and I've since come across an essay called "Women in Achebe's World" by an academic called Rose Uramezu, and I think if you're interested in that side of it, that's a great essay to read. So I'll put a link to that. A bit of a warning, it does have some spoilers for some of the books it talks about, so do be careful if you're worried about that. But I think you can see them coming in the essay, so you can sort of skip to the end of the paragraph if you are worried about that. And the great thing about that essay is that it talks about Achebe's representation of women and misogyny. It talks about how that changed throughout his career, and it does seem like there was an evolution in his attitudes from his earlier writings to his later ones, which I haven't experienced as much because I've mainly read just his earlier novels. So I think that's quite a fair and nuanced look at his representation of women and women in his worlds that he creates. The other great thing it does is the last page or so of it goes beyond Achebe's representation of women and looks at other African writers who are women and their worlds that they create and how women and women's experiences in those communities are represented in their worlds. So I think that is an interesting essay if you're interested in Achebe, but also a really interesting resource if you want to just read some great books by African women about African women who do a better job of representation than Achebe does. Overall, I do think he's an absolutely brilliant writer. If you haven't read any of his books, I hugely recommend them, and I can't wait to read the rest of them that I haven't got to yet.